What you have to express to people in no uncertain terms is there is a 100% chance that your child will be born with an intellectual disadvantage, that you are producing children below their genetic potential through inbreeding. The internet is crowded with compelling excuses for bad behavior. There are so many excuses for you to do self-indulgent things. So many voices that tell you to think of yourself and think of the short term only, and not to think of the long-term consequences for your children, for your grandchildren, for society as a whole, not even to think about the long-term consequences for yourself. This habit of mind that offers excuses for smoking marijuana, drinking alcohol, eating red meat, it's even more intense when we come to a question like first cousin marriage, or in plain English, inbreeding. It's more intense because our own egos are more directly involved. On the left-hand side of the screen, what you see here is a man who discovered that his own DNA is the product of inbreeding. He is himself the product of cousin marriage again and again and again throughout the generations in his family tree. And what does he Google around for? At the very bottom on the left-hand side, you'll see, he looked up a website called www.cousincouples.com. He didn't look up this peer-reviewed medical research article that states as an established fact that marrying your first cousin reduces the intelligence of your offspring. No, for some reason he wasn't interested in reading scientific articles of this kind. No, he turns to the internet and he finds something that's going to confirm his own high opinion of himself. And just look at it. What a great website. Has a photograph there of Albert Einstein, who married his cousin. Oh boy, Albert Einstein sure was a smart guy. He couldn't be wrong. Couldn't be wrong about marrying your first cousin. Just looking at this picture doesn't merely convince me that I would never marry any of my own cousins, but also that I would not be interested in marrying any of Albert Einstein's cousins. In any case, on the left-hand side of the screen, you see this man put some labor into charting out his own family tree. He says, at the third generation, 2 of my great-grandmother's grandparents were siblings. Susanna Mariette was a first cousin. Only Anna Barbara Hertel was related through marriage. So he's saying there's this one woman who was only related through marriage, who wasn't a cousin of the other people on this chart. The 4th generation was more of the same. 4 of the 8 were Bouteliers, who had the same last name. In the 5th generation, 3 of the 8 marriages were children from the same couple. It took me by surprise. Initially, I was stunned. Yes, this is someone who grew up in an American culture where marrying your own cousin was taboo. In some states legal, in some states illegal. And he was surprised to find that his ancestors in Canada had lived in a culture and a country where this kind of inbreeding wasn't illegal at all. It was much more common than any Canadian today wants to admit to themselves.
In Bradford, at the Achter family home, life is unbearably difficult. Martin feels constantly frustrated. His 2 sisters, Hina and Zainab, are unable to look after themselves, and their sight and hearing is getting worse. Their parents find it hard to come to terms with the idea that as first cousins, they pass down a gene that caused their children's terrible disabilities.
What have the doctors actually told you about this?
who told you that it could be anything to do with the fact that you two are first cousins?
Yes, they told this is a genetic disease, but I don't think this is right. But they told us. My other brother, he got married with her sisters. He got 5 children, all of them perfectly right. There's no disability with them.
Some families call it fate. However, doctors are in no doubt about the cause. While an average children's hospital will see 20 to 30 different recessive genetic disorders over a decade, in Bradford, one children's hospital alone has seen 165. Azmat helps out in his mum's school and baby wear shop. When he's not at college, he works on the shop floor, deals with customers and mans the till.
I'm very protective over Azmat. He's more like, I would say, 14-year-old than an 18-year-old, mentally, you know. It comes with me, you know, when he's on holiday, he comes with me to work, yeah, so I can keep an eye on him and things.
Despite what Azmat's mum has been told about the cause of his illness, she struggles to accept it.
I don't think there's anything wrong in first cousin marriages, because it's all culture and it's the norm, really. The thing is, though, it's not guaranteed that it's going to happen, though. It's like high risk, it's 1 in 4, but it could be, like, if it's 1 in 4, it's like 3 could be okay. Yeah? Just think it was one of those things. Because my daughter, she's fine.
This is the part of the equation nobody wants to deal with. Nobody wants to take this grieving mother aside and say to her, no, your daughter is not fine. This isn't a matter as simple as whether or not your child happens to have Down syndrome. It isn't a simple binary question of whether or not your child inherited one particular genetic disadvantage. Inbreeding lowers human intelligence. Indeed, this hypothesis developed in the first place because it was observed amongst farm animals. Human beings have so much experience raising animals from one generation to the next, and you can imagine in medieval times, or at least in pre-modern times, it would be quite a bit of work to take your flock of sheep some distance to meet with another flock of sheep so that you could get some fresh blood into the herd. But people learned to experience observing these animals closely, not just in their behavior, but also in the terms of their physical abnormalities that would become obvious when they were chopped up to be made into meat, or when there were higher and higher rates of stillbirths, so on and so forth. Humans learned that if they allowed animals to inbreed, if they allowed animals to marry their own cousins for generation after generation, the quality of the animals physically and intellectually would degenerate. And yes, this is the same simple, scary fact we're staring at now. Who wants to tell this woman that, oh, you know, according to this 2008 study, there is a robust negative correlation between IQ and consanguinity. Cousins marrying cousins makes human beings stupider. And no, this is not a problem confined to the predominantly Muslim parts of the world. However, if you read the abstract in full, you'll notice that part of what scientists struggle with is the difficulty of compensating for forms of social prejudice that creep into the calculus. If you're looking at poverty-stricken parts of the United States where marrying your own cousin is associated with being poorly educated and just poor, then that's going to prejudice the outcomes. Whereas, as with this paper, which is frankly a locus classicus, a much cited source from 1977, if you study these questions of cousin marriage within Arab societies where it is accepted or even encouraged for a very large percentage of the population, then you can measure the effects of genetically diminished intelligence without having to compensate for those other sources of prejudice.
Let's have a look now.
That's what it is.
Right, 156.
So he's about 5'2".
He is 5'2".
The doctors need to see him once every 6 months to monitor his health. This time, the news isn't good.
Can it get better or does it take time?
What they are?
Yeah.
I think it's hard to know. We haven't managed to completely explain why you've had this trouble. We wouldn't claim it in any way to have a complete cure or treatment for probiotic acidemia by now.
Right, so they still haven't found a cure for it?
No, because it's a genetic disease that in a way affects every cell in the body.
Okay.
You're alright.
My dream is maybe to get a good job and build something on myself and get married, have a family on my own as well. There's if you marry your cousins, it can't always work out because if you're marrying someone, you could have a disease because you don't know what that other cousin's got. So it's important to say if they have kids, you don't know if that say if that cousin's got a disease or something, how that kid could be born, because some can be born different, can't they?
I am married for the last 25 years successfully with my first cousin, and I've got 5 children. And thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they're all fine and well.
Shafkat has been married to his first cousin Shazia Khanum for 35 years. His mum and dad, Farnam Begum and Ali Bahadur, are also first cousins. Shafkat's eldest son Imran has continued the family tradition and just married his first cousin in Pakistan. That's 3 generations of first cousin marriage.
We haven't seen any negativity in it, so therefore we are all for it.
Although between 4 and 10% of the children of first cousins are at a high risk of recessive disorders, people who support cousin marriages say this means that 90 to 96% of the time, the children will be healthy.
A few of you in the audience will now be asking, don't these people realize that what they're doing is illegal? No, in fact, marrying your cousin is not illegal in the United Kingdom, in England, Scotland, and Wales. In fact, throughout Western Europe, they're almost proud of the fact that it's legal to marry your cousin, because this was part of the unique historical and cultural experience of the Protestant Reformation. Whereas medieval Catholicism was very strictly opposed to marrying your cousins, even your second cousins and third cousins, Protestantism, beginning with Martin Luther, overturned this tradition, perhaps in part just because Martin Luther was rather fond of overturning and challenging the authority of the Catholic Church as such. On the death of his elder brother, Arthur, in 1491, Henry VIII had obtained papal dispensation to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. As the marriage failed to produce a male heir, Henry petitioned the Pope for a divorce on the grounds that his marriage to Catherine, his sister-in-law, was invalid under the Levitical statutes. So in 1533, Henry established the Church of England with himself as monarch of England, the head of the church. Having embarked on this major religious realignment and wishing to marry Catherine Howard, a cousin of his executed second wife, Anne Boleyn, in 1540, Henry issued a statute that legalized marriage between all first cousins. This tradition, whether we think of it as proud or shameful, remains strangely influential in Western Europe and around the world to this day.
With scientific research showing that first cousins who marry are doubling their chances of having children with rare diseases, why is there so little awareness of this in the wider British population? Sonia and Wayne Gibbs invited me to their family home. They've been together for 16 years. Wayne is Sonia's dad's cousin, making them first cousins once removed, something that never struck them as a problem. Their child Nicole died of juvenile osteopetrosis, a genetic disease that causes the bones to thicken and crush the body's organs. They were told it was because they both carried recessive genes.
So as a parent, to sort of go from having what you thought was a perfectly healthy, normal baby, how did that feel?
Upsetting. Horrible. Feel absolutely helpless. Because you know there's just not a thing you can do.
Did you decide to have a third child? Was that planned?
Well, we went through, obviously, genetic counselling, what they call it. Because obviously we wanted to know, you know, can we have any more children?
For that test for you was absolutely essential.
It was, yes.
It was vital.
Yeah, it was vital. There was no way we was going to even, you know, have another child if there was no test out there that could help. And obviously I just would have stuck at Nathan and that would have been it. So,
and now you've got two very healthy
I've got
kids.
two very healthy boys.
And now you've got two very healthy kids.
Two very healthy boys.
I've shared with you several short clips from that documentary. Many of you may have found it meaningful, moving, or even hard-hitting. You might think, wow, that's a documentary that is going to strike a blow against human indifference and motivate people to really get out and change their ways. I'm here to tell you now the exact opposite. That documentary took the wrong approach at every stage of the argument, and I can guarantee that people will only double down on their commitment to justifying and excusing first cousin marriage. And why? Because the documentary made the mistake of expressing the problem in terms of risk. If you tell these couples they have a 7% chance, and this is the number used in newspaper headlines, sort of the soft science rounded off factoid of the day, if you tell these people that they have a 7% chance of having a child with a horrible, debilitating deformity or disability, they'll shrug their shoulders and say, well, there's still a 93% chance that the child will be perfectly fine. Even within the documentary, people say that again and again and again, and not merely when the odds are 93 versus 7, even when it's a 1 in 4 chance, when it's a 25% chance of a serious debilitating disability, and then only a 75% chance of the child being quote-unquote okay. What you have to express to people in no uncertain terms is there is a 100% chance that your child will be born with an intellectual disadvantage, that you are producing children below their genetic potential through inbreeding. People need to be told in no uncertain terms, this isn't a risk, this isn't a roll of the dice, it's a certainty, and that entails for you a very definite moral obligation to never, ever reproduce with any of your cousins.
And that's the state's argument always. That's why we have these laws, because the state has a compelling interest to prevent genetic defects in children, and that is really why we have these laws on the books.
The internet exacerbates the innate human capacity for short-term self-indulgence and excuse-making. What we need governments to do, what we need laws to do, is motivate people to look beyond their own selfish, short-term pleasure and think about what's best, not just for themselves, but others. Not just for themselves and not just for their own children and grandchildren, but for society as a whole. Television, in the era of its dominance, certainly had this same tendency to encourage people to live as infants who never take on mature responsibilities, I confess. But on your TV remote, there were only so many channels you could flip between, and each channel was just identified with a number. The remote control for the internet lets us dial in precisely the excuses that we want to hear, even for something as barbaric, even for something as destructive as first cousin marriage. can practice doing puppet show.
Yes, that's all I needed. I need it all.